In the quiet dimness of your room tonight, with the curtains drawn just enough to let a sliver of moonlight filter in, and perhaps the soft patter of rain or the distant hum of a city pressing faintly against a window, I want you to imagine a world that both belongs to us and yet feels impossibly far away, a world of stone columns and flickering oil lamps, of sandals brushing over marble floors polished by centuries of footsteps, of hushed whispers echoing in narrow streets lined with clay jars and painted walls, because this is where our story begins. Not in the battlefields or grand temples of Greece that so many history books insist on showing you, but in the hidden quarters of homes and palaces, in the places where official scribes refuse to look too closely, in the shadows where men live, lives that were never truly their own. And it is here in those shadows that you will meet the male concubine, a figure both desired and despised, treasured and disposable, whose life was as fragile as the clay cups they held at feasts, whose existence was shaped by beauty, politics, silence, and survival. And while this is called boring history, tonight it may keep you listening longer than you thought, because what you are about to hear was never meant for you to hear at all. So before we sink deeper, subscribe to our channel, allow yourself to rest, and tell me softly in your heart, where are you listening from? Is it a bed in Lahore, a couch in New York, a quiet balcony in Karachi, or a midnight bus rolling through London? Because you are part of this listening now, and history is whispering directly to you, inviting you to drift closer, slower into its hidden folds. Picture the stillness of Athens at night when the symposiums ended and the men had staggered home, their sandals dragging and their robes half undone, leaving behind the slaves to clean spilled wine and pick up the fragments of broken pottery. And among those slaves were the boys, sometimes no more than 15, sometimes older, chosen for their beauty, their wide eyes, their soft skin, chosen not because of who they were, but because of how they appeared in the torchlight. And these boys would be sent not to their own beds, but to the chambers of men who believed themselves philosophers, warriors, and leaders. And there they became both a secret and a necessity, an adornment and a shame, a life forced into silence, yet always watched. You may be lying comfortably now with your blanket pulled up and your body sinking into calmness. But imagine the soft dread of being summoned after midnight, the sound of heavy feet in sandals approaching, the rustle of robes, the flicker of the oil lamp announcing that you would not sleep that night, not as yourself, but as someone's possession. And here is where the story gets stranger. In Greece, this arrangement was not entirely hidden. It was both condemned and celebrated. A strange paradox where poets wrote verses filled with longing for beautiful boys, where vases were painted with scenes of men and their youthful companions, yet, at the same time, the law, the gossip of the agora, and the muttered scorn of old men all tangled together to create a maze of shame and honor, so that the concubine walked a narrow path, always balancing between being cherished and being discarded. Think of how strange it is that history remembers the battles of Marathon and Thermopylae, the speeches of Pericles, the philosophies of Socrates and Plato, but in the same breath, it forgets the trembling hands of a concubine pouring wine into a cup at those very feasts, the way his shadow bent across the marble floor while laughter filled the air above him, as if the sound of his own heartbeat was never part of the story. But it was, and tonight, softly, I want to restore it. You may already feel your eyelids growing heavier as I describe it, but follow me a little further. Imagine the inner quarters of a wealthy Athenian house. The andron, the men's dining room, with couches lined against the walls, red clay vessels, painted with black figures resting on low tables, the smell of roasted meats mixing with the sharp bite of wine. And in the corner, near the doorway, the concubine stands, silent, watching, waiting, knowing that at any moment a guest's hand might beckon him forward, not as an equal, never as an equal, but as something closer to an object of exchange, a symbol of wealth and power, because to own or keep such a companion was not just about pleasure, it was about status. It was about saying to the city, look how much I control, look how much I can take. And yet, here lies the gentle, sad truth. Behind the laughter, behind the performance, behind the painted vases and written verses, these young men often long for something as simple as being able to sleep without fear, to have a moment that belonged to themselves, a night where their body was not borrowed by another's desires. This is the paradox of the male concubine in Greece. Their existence was both celebrated in art and despised in daily life, and while the world outside. Your window right now may be quiet. Their world was filled with the quiet terror of being wanted for everything but themselves. Imagine lying down on a simple straw mattress, your back against cold stone, your ears still ringing with the laughter of men you served, and wondering whether your beauty would fade tomorrow, whether you would be sent away, beaten, or forgotten. Because the life of a concubine was tied to something that could never last forever: youth. And so their story, like a soft candle flicker, is always on the edge of disappearing. Yet tonight we hold it for a little while in our own quiet. And before we close this part, let me leave you with a thought to pull you gently into the next. What happens to a person who becomes both a treasure and a curse? Who is sculpted into an ideal yet denied the dignity of being human? Because in part 2, we will follow one of them more closely, from the streets of Athens to the chamber of a man who was both his captor and his protector. And you will see how the line between desire and destruction was always blurred in ancient Greece when the morning light spread softly across Athens, gilding the rooftops and temples with that pale shimmer that only stone can hold. The male concubine would often wake not to the sound of birds or the call of the marketplace, but to the groan of wooden doors, the heavy footsteps of a master's household stirring, and the quiet dread that every day was both the same and never predictable. Because in a world where your body was not your own, even the rhythm of the sun was not yours to trust. And here, in these fragile hours, the story becomes both clearer and more unsettling. Imagine the boy, his hair oiled and combed to perfection, his robe tied loosely to reveal the youth his master prized, walking through the inner courtyard where potted plants, fig trees, and small fountains attempted to mimic paradise. Yet for him it was only another stage where he must be seen but never heard, present but never acknowledged as fully human. And this contradiction is what makes his life both tragic and strangely invisible in the records. Because Greek writers praised beauty, wrote poems about the radiance of youth, compared young men to gods and heroes, but seldom allowed the boys themselves to speak. Their words washed away like chalk in the rain, leaving only the silhouettes that others carved of them. The daily reality was full of ritual. He will prepare perfumes and oils for his master, help dress him for the agora, arrange sandals, polish bronze mirrors, and stand by silently as men discuss politics that would reshape Athens, wars that would define an era, while he was treated as if his presence were air, necessary but unacknowledged. And sometimes, when errands called, he will be sent through the crowded streets, blending into the noise of vendors calling out figs, olives, fish fresh from Piraeus, and in those moments, perhaps for a few breaths, he felt the closest thing to freedom. Because no one knew by looking that he belonged to another man's chamber, that his nights were not his own, that his smile could never be entirely his. And yet, in that same crowd, the danger was always present. Eyes that lingered too long, whispers that followed. Because beauty in a boy was both an adornment and a curse, drawing attention that could mean opportunity, but also suspicion, envy, even violence. For the city had laws, yes, strange laws that at once glorified such relationships and condemned them, making the concubine's existence a legal tightrope where one misstep could mean disgrace or punishment, not for the master, who could often buy his way out, but for the boy who had no shield beyond his fading youth. The oddest detail, and one that history rarely tells, is that some of these boys were gifted with elaborate jewelry, bracelets, anklets, even delicate wreaths for their hair, not as symbols of their own worth, but as trophies for their masters. To display, like saying, "Look at the beauty I possess. Look at the rarity I control." And while such tokens glittered in Torchlight, to the boy they felt heavy, Reminders of chains he could not see yet always felt pressing against his skin. Now imagine the quiet humor of it all. Though bittersweet, philosophers could argue all day about the virtue of self-control, about moderation in all things, about the nobility of restraint. And then, as night fell, the very same men would call for wine, for song, for boys. And suddenly moderation was forgotten. Self-control dissolved into indulgence, and the concubine, waiting at the edge of the room, could only smile inwardly at the irony, though he dared not let it slip onto his face, for even the smallest gesture of mockery could invite punishment, and so humor became internal, silent, a private rebellion hidden beneath lowered eyes. Yet behind these faint moments of irony was always the deeper, darker truth. The concubine's body age, his beauty would not last forever, and with each passing season, each line, each sign of maturity, the fear grew heavier. What happens when I am no longer the youth they want? When my worth in their eyes vanishes? Some were discarded, some sold into harsher forms of slavery, some sent to labor in fields or workshops, their past erased as if it had never existed. And a few, very few, managed to transition into other roles, scribes, attendants, sometimes even lovers whose bonds endured past the frailty of youth. But most faded into silence, leaving no name, no memory, just the shadows painted on pottery and the fragments of poems written not by them, but about them. Let yourself sink into this thought as you rest. Imagine lying in that narrow bed, the straw rustling beneath you, the faint glow of an oil lamp quivering against the walls, hearing footsteps approach, knowing that tonight might be indulgence, or punishment, or dismissal, and the cruelest part was not knowing which, because unpredictability was the concubine's constant companion, like a shadow that never left. Outside, the city slept, the Parthenon rising in majesty against the starlit sky, the statues of gods standing silent and eternal, and yet inside, in the chambers of men, fragile lives unfolded, lives that would never be sung in epic poems, lives that were beautiful only so long as they remained silent. And as you drift further into calmness, let this image hold you, a boy walking along the stoa at dawn, his robe drawn tightly against the morning chill, watching the philosophers gather, hearing their lofty words about virtue and the good life, and wondering quietly if such words would ever apply to someone like him, or if he was destined always to be both present and absent, desired and denied. And with that thought, we turn gently toward what comes next. In part 3, we will enter more deeply into one concubine's secret night in the house of a powerful Athenian, where the fragile veil between affection and exploitation was pulled thinner than ever, and where the questions of love, power, and survival tangled in ways that history has almost completely forgotten, but which tonight softly we will remember together. The house of a wealthy Athenian after sunset was both a sanctuary and a stage, a place where the shadows played tricks against the walls, where oil lamps trembled in their bronze holders, and where every gesture, every silence carried weight. And on this particular night, the concubine was summoned earlier than usual, drawn into the inner chamber where the master awaited, reclining on a couch covered in dyed fabrics, the air heavy with the sweetness of burning incense, mixed with the faint tang of sea salt drifting through the shutters. And here, in this fragile light, the boy became more than a servant, yet less than a person. Placed in that unsettling space where affection and ownership intertwined, where a caress could feel like kindness one moment, and like a chain the next. And to understand this world, you must soften into it, letting the details arrive slowly. Like the flicker of lamp flames across painted pottery, the vessels etched with scenes of lovers and warriors, the couches arranged in symmetry, the lyre in the corner waiting to be played, and the boy himself, dressed in a robe chosen not for his comfort, but to flatter the master's gaze, his hair bound with a small ribbon, his skin lightly dusted with perfume powder, as if even his body must be sculpted into art before it could be accepted. In such nights, conversation often came before touch. the master asking questions that felt both intimate and rehearsed. "Do you know the story of Ganymede?" And the boy nodding softly, for how many times had he been compared to that myth? The beautiful youth abducted by Zeus, taken to Olympus to serve as cupbearer and lover. And though the myth was told as a tale of honor, of divine elevation, for the boy it always rang with irony, because what was abduction but a polite word for theft? And what was love without choice but another mask for power? And yet he knew. He must smile faintly, lower his eyes, pretend the myth was a compliment rather than a prophecy he already lived. Here the history grows stranger still, because in Athens, such relationships were openly referenced in art and poetry, yet also bound by unspoken rules. Too much display was vulgar, too much attachment dangerous, too little discretion a risk to one's reputation. And so the concubine's life was shaped not only by the desires of one man, but by the silent judgments of an entire city that pretended not to look while watching closely. Imagine the quiet humor hidden in this. The master would speak of virtue, of the noble love between older and younger, while in the same breath warning the boy never to be seen with another, never to offer a glance or a word that might stir suspicion. As if love could be noble and paranoid at once. And the boy, with a soft inward smile, learned to navigate these contradictions, collecting them like stones in his pocket, heavy but invisible. But beneath the humor was always the darker thread, the fear that affection could turn to anger in an instant, that the same hand which placed a garland on his hair could strike across his cheek, that the warmth of being chosen could become the coldness of being discarded. And so he lived in a state of constant alertness, every breath measured, every movement calculated to maintain a fragile balance, because to falter was to risk not only punishment, but also the collapse of the only road that protected him from harsher forms of slavery. Outside, the night deepened, the city quieter now. Only the distant call of guards on patrol, and the occasional bark of a dog breaking the silence. And within the chamber, the boy poured wine, his hand steady though his heart quickened each movement, a ritual he knew too well. The tilting of the jug, the careful holding of the cup, the bow of the head as he offered it. And in those moments, he was both invisible and essential, both object and symbol, a paradox that defined his existence. What history rarely tells us is how these boys carried small fragments of themselves into survival. A song hummed under their breath when no one listened, a carved trinket hidden beneath a mattress, a secret memory of their mother's voice or the smell of their childhood home. Tiny anchors that reminded them they were more than what they had been reduced to. And these fragments, though invisible to the grand sweep of history, were the true stories of survival, the whispered truths that allowed them to endure. And perhaps you, lying now in your own bed, can feel the gentle resonance of this truth, that even in lives constrained, there was still an inner world, still small acts of defiance woven in the silence. The boy on this night listened to the master's words about politics, about Sparta and alliances, about the endless rivalries that defined Athens, and he realized with a strange clarity that he, too, was a kind of alliance, a possession meant to symbolize status, a fragile peace offering in the theater of desire and power. And that recognition, though painful, gave him an odd strength. For to see the game was to know it was a game, even if he could not escape its rules. Imagine now the slow drifting of your own thoughts like his, as the lamplight flickered lower, as the master's voice softened into drowsiness, as the night stretched thin, and the boy, still awake, still alert, wondered how many more years of youth he had before the game discarded him entirely. Outside, the stars wheeled above the Acropolis, silent witnesses to lives never recorded. And inside, a boy lay beside a man who would be remembered in history books while his own name dissolved into dust. And yet, for this moment, we hold him here, alive in your listening, alive in our remembering. And softly, before your eyes close fully, let me lead you toward what awaits in part 4. We will step beyond one night into the broader rhythm of a concubine's life in Greece, following the rituals, the festivals, the strange public-private balance that made his existence both celebrated and erased. And you will see how the world of marble and gods always casts its longest shadows on those who had no voice, but whose silence still shapes the story. The life of a male concubine in ancient Greece was not measured only in nights spent within the master's chamber, nor in the weight of a garland or the sting of a command, but also in the long, slow rhythm of the city itself, in the way Athens breathed through its festivals, its processions, its marketplaces, and its endless obsession with performance. For to live as a concubine was to exist not just in private, but also in the strange half-light of public life, where silence was expected, and yet presence was demanded, where one could be invisible in speech, but unavoidable in sight. And this paradox became clearest during the great festivals that defined the Athenian calendar, moments when the entire city seemed to pulse with music, torchlight, and ritual. Picture the Parthenon, the grand festival held in honor of Athena, when citizens marched in solemn procession up to the Acropolis, carrying woven robes to clothe the great statue of the goddess, when the air was filled with the sound of flutes and the clatter of hooves, when sacrifices smoked on the altars and poets competed in song. And somewhere among that crowd, perhaps carrying water, perhaps arranging seats, perhaps merely walking silently behind his master, was the concubine, his beauty not his own but an accessory for another man's pride. And yet for a moment, as the sun struck the white marble of the Parthenon, as the city gathered in awe beneath the watching gods, he may have felt the swell of belonging, as if he, too, was part of something larger, even if history refused to name him. In these festivals, the contradictions multiplied. The same poets who sang of noble love also mocked the weakness of those who submitted. The same laws that regulated citizenship excluded anyone marked as a concubine from honor, and yet the very statues carved by artisans displayed their likeness in secret gestures, reminding us that what was denied in words often lingered in images. Strange details appear in the record vases showing youths at banquets, their eyes wide with both fear and allure. Comic plays where effeminate boys were ridiculed on stage to the laughter of crowds, fragments of speeches where orators accused rivals of having once been concubines, as if to say that even in adulthood, the shadow of such a past was inescapable. And these details tell us that the concubine's life was not only a private wound, but also a public vulnerability, a secret that could be weaponized, a past that never truly stayed buried. Now imagine the gentle humor that only someone living this life might notice. The way philosophers could praise the pursuit of truth and wisdom during the day, and then, drunk at night, stumble into contradictions so obvious that even a boy serving wine could have spotted them, and though he dared not laugh aloud, he carried those ironies inside him like secret treasures, a kind of silent comedy whispered only to himself, the kind of humor that softened the hardness of survival. But beneath the festivals and ironies was always the darker current, that beauty, youth, and obedience were a currency that expired quickly, that every festival, every banquet, was also a countdown, and the boy who stood silently today might tomorrow be replaced, his value dissolved in the same way the smoke of sacrifices vanished into the sky. This fragility haunted him even in moments of apparent glory, when he walked at his master's side during a procession, when other men's eyes lingered on him, when whispers spread about his presence. He could feel both exalted and diminished, for he was not admired as himself, but as an extension of someone else's wealth. And that realization, carried quietly in his chest, was both a wound and a strange kind of knowledge, for he saw more clearly than the men who owned him the shallow theater of power that ran through the city. At night, after the festival fires dimmed and the crowds dispersed, he would return to the chamber, his feet sore from walking, his ears still echoing with chants and laughter, and he would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if the gods, who had received the city's sacrifices, had any room left to notice someone like him, or if divinity, like men, cared only for offerings that could be measured and displayed. History rarely records these quiet questions, but they are perhaps the most human of all. The whispered doubts that carried the concubine through long nights of waiting, the silent prayers that never made it into epics. And as you lie in your own bed now, listening softly, let yourself feel that paradox, the blending of splendor and sorrow, the way a boy could walk among torches and statues, part of the very heartbeat of Athens, and yet remain nameless, unseen, forgotten the moment his beauty faded. This was the cruelest truth of all, that while Greece carved its ideals into marble and painted its myths on clay, the real lives of those who embodied those ideals were left to vanish like shadows at dawn. Yet tonight, gently, we remember them, and we hold their silence as part of our own. Let this thought carry you softly into rest, and follow me onward. In Part 5, we will enter the hidden economy of concubinage in Greece, the buying and selling, the negotiations of households, the strange and unsettling ways in which desire was quantified like grain or wine. And in doing so, you will see how beneath the poetry and the festivals was always the unspoken truth that bodies were traded like currency, and that the concubines. Tragedy was not only personal, but woven into the very structure of the city itself. The economy of Athens, often remembered for its bustling agora where merchants sold olives, fish, figs, and wine beneath the watchful eyes of statues and temples, had another economy that rarely appears in the pages of history books, an economy measured not in coins alone but in flesh, beauty, and silence. For the male concubine was not merely a figure of desire, but also a commodity whose worth was negotiated, bargained, and quietly transferred in ways that made his life feel less like destiny and more like inventory. And to understand the tragedy of such an existence, you must imagine the marketplace not only as a place of goods, but as a stage where status was displayed, where men might flaunt their ability to maintain a youth at their side, where boys' presence was as much a symbol of wealth as a fine horse or a house with painted walls. And this meant that behind the poetry and the painted vases, there was always the cruel reality of trade. Picture the scene. In a shaded corner of the agora, where money changers clinked their drachmas and potters arranged their wares, deals might be whispered between masters whose boy was more beautiful. Who could be persuaded to part with him? What price might secure such a treasure? And though no inscription survives to detail the numbers, fragments of speeches and plays give hints, mocking rivals for having been sold cheaply, accusing enemies of having spent fortunes on companions who did not last, as if to reduce a human life to the same banter one might use for livestock or wine. This is the cruel comedy of it. Men who prided themselves on philosophy and reason still spoke of concubines as though they were goods, praising or mocking them by cost, treating affection as a transaction, and while they laughed, the boy himself stood nearby, silent, pretending not to hear that his worth was being haggled like grain. The system extended deeper still into households, for concubines were not always chosen by masters directly. Sometimes they were gifts offered by wealthy families as tokens of alliance. Sometimes they were purchased through intermediaries. Sometimes even kidnapped in war, taken as spoils alongside gold and cattle. And in each case, the boy had no voice. His fate decided in rooms where he was not invited, his future mapped by hands that would never carry his burden. And here lies an unusual, rarely spoken detail. Records suggest that certain households kept account books that included expenses for oil, wine, and servants, and among those lines scholars believe were notes for the maintenance of youths listed, as though their existence was another form of property upkeep, reminders that even in ledgers their humanity was erased, leaving only the numbers that marked how much it cost to keep them adorned and perfumed. Imagine the strange irony of this, that while philosophers wrote of the soul, of freedom, of the highest forms of love, a concubine's existence could be reduced to the price of a comb or the tally of oil lamps burned in a single night. And perhaps the boy himself, if he ever glimpsed such a list, would have felt both shock and resignation, knowing that what he had already felt in his body was now carved into ink. Yet even within this economy, power was never simple, for beauty gave the boy a dangerous kind of leverage. If he pleased, if he enchanted, if he held a master's attention, He could enjoy luxuries denied to other slaves, fine clothes, jewelry, even moments of affection that felt genuine. And though such privileges were fragile, they allowed him to carve out fleeting islands of comfort in a sea of uncertainty. But this too was double-edged, for jealousy lurked in the corners. Rivals within the household, wives who saw their status threatened, other youths eager to take his place, all creating a web where survival required not only beauty, but vigilance, diplomacy, and silence. Think of the gentle humor in this precarious game. The boy, who was treated as if he were a prized possession, might know more about the household secrets than anyone else. Hearing confessions whispered after wine, witnessing arguments between master and wife, noticing alliances and betrayals before they were spoken aloud. And though he could not laugh openly at the hypocrisy, inwardly, he may have cherished the small satisfaction of knowing he held knowledge none suspected. Still, beneath the humor lay the heavy truth, that his life was never his own, that his worth expired the moment his youth dimmed, that every gift, every garland, every robe was only on loan until the day he was replaced, and then the same men, who once called him beautiful, would pretend not to remember him at all. At night, in the small chamber where he rested, perhaps with only a thin blanket and the glow of a fading lamp, he might trace these thoughts like cracks in the plaster above his bed, wondering how long he had before his master's attention shifted, before his name dissolved into silence, before his body was traded again, not as someone beloved, but as someone no longer needed. And as you listen now, resting more deeply, imagine the faint echo of coins dropping into a scale, the sound of sandals across marble floors, the low murmur of men bargaining in corners of the agora, and within those sounds, hear the unspoken truth, that beauty was currency, and that lives could be bought and sold as easily as oil or wine. This truth, heavy but quiet, shaped the concubine's tragedy more than any myth or poem, and it reminds us softly tonight that beneath every grand city are the lives it chose not to remember. And so we turn gently toward part 6, where we will step beyond the marketplace and into the private rituals of the household itself, exploring the strange blend of intimacy and performance, the nightly routines that blurred the line between affection and command. And in doing so, we will glimpse how survival was not only about being owned, but about learning how to endure the long hours when desire was dressed up as devotion dot inside the walls of a wealthy Athenian household. Beyond the chatter of the agora and the pageantry of festivals, the life of a male concubine unfolded through routines that were as predictable in their patterns as they were unpredictable in their outcomes. For while his nights often carried the weight of summons and touch, his days were filled with rituals that blurred intimacy with performance, devotion with command. And to understand this, you must imagine the household not simply as a home, but as a stage where everyone played roles, from the master issuing orders, to the wife arranging her status, to the slaves laboring silently, and among them, the concubine hovering in that strange place between ornament and servant. The mornings might begin with small acts that seemed tender, but were never fully free. Arranging the master's clothes, laying out perfumes and oils, brushing his hair with careful strokes, even offering small fruits or bread while speaking. Only when asked, gestures that looked affectionate yet were rehearsed, repeated until they became a choreography of survival. And within this dance, the boy learned to read moods with a precision that was almost instinctive, sensing whether a silence meant displeasure or distraction, whether a sigh was the prelude to kindness or to anger. For his safety depended on interpreting what others left unsaid. This was his quiet art, the art of reading the room, and it gave him a strange kind of wisdom about people that philosophers, for all their words, often lacked. Imagine the scene at midday, the wife of the house busying herself with women's quarters, the children playing with small clay toys, the slaves bustling with chores, and in the center of it all, the boy standing by with a jug of wine, present but peripheral, noticed only when needed. And yet his presence carried a tension that the entire household felt, a reminder that desire and resentment coexisted under the same roof, that he was at once a source of pride to the master and a thorn to the mistress, a silent disruption to the harmony that homes pretended to have. The strange details history seldom tells appear here. Records of wives bringing public lawsuits against husbands for keeping concubines too openly. Fragments of plays mocking women who fumed while their husbands flaunted their boys. Hints of quiet rivalries in which the concubine became both scapegoat and symbol. Blamed for what was really the imbalance of a society that gave men license and women silence. For the boy himself, this meant that every day was a balancing act not just of serving the master, but of navigating the mistress's cold glances, the servant's envy, and the children's innocent stares that sometimes held curiosity and sometimes confusion, as if they too knew he did not belong yet could not imagine the world without him. And yet, within these tensions, there were also soft rituals that blurred the line between affection and duty. Sitting by the master's couch to play music on a lyre, reciting memorized poetry in the evenings, rubbing oils into tired shoulders. After a long day in the agora, acts that might have seemed like intimacy, but were always bounded by the fact that refusal was never possible, that affection was performed because it was required, and in this, the boy's life became a theater, where every smile, every touch, was both real and unreal at the same time. Imagine the quiet humor he might have carried inwardly, that philosophers who spent hours debating the nature of love, writing dialogues about noble affection between men and youths, might never notice how much of that nobility was built on silence, on roles performed under compulsion, on the careful choreography of those who had no choice but to comply, and the boy, hearing such lofty words while pouring wine or strumming strings, may have smiled faintly to himself, recognizing the gap between theory and reality. Yet beneath this faint humor was the darker truth that each ritual reinforced his status, not as equal, but as adornment, as someone valuable so long as he could maintain the illusion of youth, grace, and compliance, and the awareness of this truth made each gesture heavier, each day a reminder that he was both cared for and controlled. At night, when the master's household grew quieter, when the streets outside dimmed, and only the faint call of night watchmen echoed, the ritual shifted into something more private, yet no less performative. The boy might be summoned to sing, softly, to recount myths, to listen to his master's thoughts about politics or philosophy, and eventually, to share the bed where tenderness and command intertwined in ways that could not be separated. And here, the boy learned another kind of ritual, the art of disappearing within himself, of holding parts of his soul untouched even as his body was demanded, a survival skill that history never recorded, but which must have been passed silently from one to another. Imagine lying there, the lamp flickering low, the master's arm heavy across his chest, and thinking of the small fragments that were still his own, a childhood memory of running barefoot through dusk, the taste of figs stolen from a tree, the voice of his mother calling him by his true name, not the name his master used, and these fragments, tiny as they were, became his sanctuary, the inner temple no one could enter. This is the unspoken history, the one you rarely hear. That survival for concubines was not only physical but spiritual, the quiet art of holding on to some piece of themselves that could not be purchased, traded, or silenced, and that, perhaps, is the most human truth of all. And as you let your own eyes grow heavier now, listening to this unfolding life, remember the stillness of those hours, the blending of intimacy and performance, the thin line between affection and command, and let this thought guide you gently. Forward, in Part 7, we will leave the private household to follow the concubine into the symposiums, the great drinking parties of Athens, where masks of laughter and philosophy covered deeper truths, and where the concubine's role became once more public and more hidden, a paradox that reveals how Greek society both glorified and erased him in the same breath. If the private household was a stage where a male concubine performed intimacy in silence, then the symposium was a theater where his presence was magnified by wine, music, and the self-importance of men who fancied themselves philosophers and poets. For in those evenings, when couches were arranged in circles, when garlands of ivy were placed on foreheads, when flutes and lyres filled the smoky air with melodies, The concubine became both servant and spectacle, moving among reclining men with jugs of wine, pouring into shallow kylix cups his laughter. Swelled, and yet always aware that though he was central to the ritual, he was never considered a guest, never granted a couch of his own, but always lingering at the edge of the light, visible enough to be desired, invisible enough to be ignored. Imagine the room, low tables set with olives, cheese, figs, roasted meats, pottery painted with scenes of gods and heroes, the smell of incense mingling with sweat and spilled drink, the flicker of lamplight catching on bronze cups, and through it all the concubine weaving quietly, his robe brushing the floor, his hand steady as he poured, his eyes lowered but his ears open, catching fragments of debate men arguing whether virtue was innate or taught, whether love elevated the soul or merely distracted it, and all the while he knew that when the talk grew slurred with wine, when the laughter turned coarse, those lofty words would collapse in the hands reaching, eyes beckoning, demands unspoken but expected. This was the paradox of the Symposium. It was at once the pinnacle of Greek intellectual life and the setting for its most unguarded indulgences, and the concubine stood at the hinge of those contradictions, carrying knowledge he could never share, seeing hypocrisy he could never expose. Strange details survive in fragments of comedy and vase paintings, scenes of boys carrying trays, men reaching for them under the pretense of conversation, hints that while philosophy filled the air, so too did desire, barely concealed, often celebrated, sometimes mocked, and these details remind us that the Symposium was not only about ideas but about display, a place where owning a beautiful concubine marked a man as cultured, wealthy, and enviable. Imagine the soft humor the boy must have carried inwardly, listening to a man praise moderation while demanding his cup be refilled for the 5th time, or hearing one extol virtue while slipping a hand toward him, or watching them mock others for weaknesses they themselves embodied. And though he dared not let the humor reach his lips, it may have been his only refuge, a way of reminding himself that he saw through the performance, even if he could never speak it. Yet beneath this irony was always the darker truth, that the Symposium could also be dangerous, for wine loosened tongues, envy sharpened glances, rivalry spilled into the open. And in then those volatile hours, the concubine's body could become the arena for another man's insult or the prize in a contest of pride, and he, without voice or choice, bore the weight of their gains. Sometimes the master would parade him more openly, calling attention to his beauty, making him sing or play the lyre before the guests, treating his presence as proof of his own refinement. And though the boy performed as instructed, inside he may have felt both exposed and diminished, knowing that every note, every movement was not his own but another's claim over him. Afterward, when the night waned and the guests stumbled out into the streets, when the flutes fell silent and the lamps guttered low, the concubine was left to clean the remnants of the feast, to gather the cups, to sweep the floor, his body. Weary from both service and spectacle, his mind heavy with the awareness that tomorrow the pattern would repeat. Another feast, another debate, another night of laughter that was not his to share. And yet, within these endless repetitions, there were small acts of survival, a moment of listening to the music and letting it be his own, a glance stolen at the stars when he stepped briefly outside to empty wine dregs, a quiet hum beneath, his breath while sweeping, as if to remind himself that even here, in this theater of power and pretense, there was still a self beyond the role imposed on him. Let yourself imagine it as you drift now, the sound of flutes fading, the echo of laughter dissolving into night air, the soft shuffle of his feet across the floor, and in that stillness, hear the question that lingered always for him: how much of this was love? How much was ownership? And did the men reclining on those couches even know the difference? This is the tragedy and the mystery of his life, a life that was essential to the culture yet erased from its memory, and tonight we breathe it back into being. And so we move gently onward, and in part 8 we will follow the concubine not in the Symposia but in the streets of Athens themselves, in the crowded agora by day and the dim alleys by night, to see how the public gaze, the whisper of strangers, and the city's relentless pulse shaped him into both a symbol and a shadow, living in full view yet hidden all the same. If the Symposium was the theater of philosophy and indulgence, then the streets of Athens were the stage where the concubine lived his paradox most openly, for here he was not hidden behind walls or soft by lamplight, but exposed to the raw gaze of the city, walking through crowds where every glance could mean admiration, curiosity, envy, or disdain, and where he had to carry himself carefully, always aware that though his beauty was celebrated in private, in public it was a vulnerability, a mark that drew attention he could not control. Imagine him moving through the agora at midday, the sun burning white on the marble colonnades, vendors shouting over one another about fresh fish, figs, olives, honey, clay vessels painted with heroic myths, the smell of roasted meats and smoke, drifting across the square, and in the midst of it all the concubine walking with a jug of wine to deliver, or perhaps with a basket of bread, his robe chosen by his master, his hair tied with ribbon. A figure both ordinary in his errand and extraordinary in the way eyes followed him, whispers curling through the crowd like smoke, some marveling at his beauty, others muttering slurs, some envious, some desirous, but all aware that he was not his own. This was the cruel paradox of Athens. In private chambers and at symposiums, his presence was flaunted as a symbol of status, but in the open streets, his role could be turned into an insult, a mark of shame, for rivals might hiss that his master was debased for keeping him, or that the boy himself was corrupt. And in the weaponized gossip of the polis, the concubine became a target for ridicule without ever speaking a word. Strange fragments survive in orations. Politicians accused each other of having once been concubines in youth, using it as proof of weakness or corruption, as if beauty itself were a crime once it no longer pleased. And so the concubine walking through the city knew that every step left a trace, not only in the dust of the streets, but in the rumors that might follow him long after. Yet there was also another side, quieter, more human. In the alleys behind the market stalls, away from the din, he might pause for a moment of stillness, leaning against a wall cooled by shadow, listening to the distant hum of the city, breathing in the smell of herbs from a nearby stall, savoring the rare moment when no one demanded, no one called, no one watched, and for a heartbeat, he could imagine that he belonged only to himself. These small fragments of freedom, though brief, were the secret fuel of his endurance, as vital as food or sleep, reminders that beyond the role of concubine, there was still a soul moving quietly within him. Imagine the gentle humor he may have found in the city, overhearing vendors argue endlessly about the price of figs as if it were the fate of nations, watching philosophers quarrel in the Stoa about the nature of justice while ignoring the injustice that walked right past them, listening to men boast of their bravery in war while cowering at the sight of an angry wife. These small ironies must have given him a private smile, a sense that even the great men of Athens were tangled in contradictions as absurd as his own life. But beneath the humor was the darker truth. The streets were not only filled with laughter and trade, but also with danger. For drunken men leaving taverns might jeer at him, strangers might reach for him, and his own beauty could provoke violence as easily as desire. And so every walk through the city was a negotiation, a performance of posture and silence, a way of appearing untouchable while feeling constantly exposed. By night, the streets changed character. The shouts of vendors faded, torches flickered in doorways, flute music drifted from taverns, dogs barked in the distance, and the concubine might be sent on errands even then, carrying messages or food. Through alleys where shadows pressed closer, where every figure could be threat or friend, where the city itself seemed to watch him with the same double gaze that always held part admiration, part scorn. And yet, within these streets, he could also see the full spectrum of Athens. The poor huddled in corners, artisans bent over their crafts, women carrying water jugs balanced on their heads, children laughing in the dust, soldiers boasting of campaigns, old men muttering about politics, and among them he recognized that his life, though bound, was woven into the same fabric, that he was both separate from and part of this restless city, that his silence was one of the many silences upon which Athens built its noise. As you drift now, let yourself imagine walking those streets with him, hearing the clatter of sandals, the call of merchants, the murmur of gossip, the quiet laughter of children, and the way the city, in all its contradictions, pressed in on him at every turn, shaping him into both shadow and symbol. And let this image carry you forward softly, because in Part 9, we will step deeper into how the city's public gaze shaped not just his movements, but his very identity, exploring how rumors, laws, and reputations turn his private life into a public weapon, and how even in silence, his existence was used to decide questions of honor and shame in the courts of Athens. If the streets of Athens exposed the concubine to whispers and wandering eyes, the courts of Athens turned his very existence into a weapon that men wielded against one another. For in this city where democracy was born and justice was debated endlessly, the life of a male concubine was both absent from the law and constantly present in accusation. His silence exploited in orations that thundered through the air of the dicasteria, the people's courts, where jurors listened to speeches filled with scorn, mockery, and veiled reminders that to have once been a concubine was a stain that no adulthood could wash away. Imagine the scene. Rows of jurors sitting on benches under the open sky. A crowd gathered, the orator rising with gestures broad enough to stir laughter or outrage, his voice carrying over the din of the city, and in the rhythm of his attack, he might accuse his rival of having lived as a concubine in his youth, painting him as weak, effeminate, unfit to lead, as if beauty once enjoyed was a permanent mark of shame. And the audience, so quick to worship beauty in poetry and art, so eager to adorn their cups with painted youths, would roar with laughter at the insult, complicit in the contradiction that both glorified and degraded the same figure. Strange details survive in speeches of Demosthenes, Aeschines, and other orators, where accusations of prostitution or concubinage were hurled not as private wounds, but as public weapons. And though these words often tell us nothing about the actual lives of those accused, they reveal how the figure of the concubine haunted the imagination of Athens, a ghost that could be summoned at will to destroy another's reputation. For the boy still living this life, hearing of such accusations must have been unsettling. To realize that his role was not only a private burden, but also a public curse, a story that could follow him long after he had been discarded, a rumor that could shape how the city judged him, even if he never stood in the courtroom himself. And yet there is gentle humor in the irony of it. The very men who hurled such insults may themselves have kept concubines in their households, may themselves have written verses to their beauty, may themselves have reclined at symposiums where boys poured their wine. And so the insult was not about morality, but about power, about who could shame whom, about who could turn silence into a weapon. The concubine himself, if he stood at the edges of the crowd, perhaps carrying water for his master attending the trial, may have felt the strangeness of it, to hear his own role debated in thunderous speeches, his existence reduced to a punchline, his life used as a metaphor for corruption, and yet to remain invisible, unnamed, unable to interrupt. Imagine the quiet darkness of that realization, that no matter how carefully he moved through the city, no matter how silently he survived, the shadow of his role would linger in the air like smoke, used by others for battles he did not choose. At night, lying awake in the small chamber given to him, hearing the distant noise of the city dying down, the boy may have wondered whether his name would ever be safe, whether the whispers would follow him even when his beauty faded, whether the life he lived in silence would always echo louder in the mouths of others than in his own memory. And still, there was resilience in him, the small act of holding on to fragments of self that no court could mock away, the memory of laughter with another servant, the taste of a stolen fig, the feel of cool stone beneath his bare feet at dawn. These tiny anchors reminded him that though the city twisted his existence into insult, within himself there was still something unspoken, untouchable. Let yourself imagine this now as you rest, the roar of the courtroom fading, the echo of accusations dissolving into the night. And in the quiet that follows, hear the boy's heartbeat, steady, unbroken, carrying him forward, despite the weight of being both adored and despised. And softly, before your thoughts drift further, let me lead you into part 10, where we will step into the darker corners of this life, the punishments, the dangers, the moments when disobedience or suspicion turn affection into cruelty, and how even within such shadows the concubine found ways, however fragile, to endure. If the courts of Athens turned the concubine's existence into a weapon of reputation, the private punishments of the household revealed the darker truth that affection and cruelty were often separated by only a breath. For the boy lived always under the weight of suspicion too compliant, and he was mocked as weak, too independent, and he was scolded as insolent, too visible, and he risked envy, too hidden, and he risked neglect, and so he learned quickly that even silence could be punished, that even obedience could be misinterpreted, and that survival meant walking a line as narrow as a thread. Imagine the moments when displeasure stirred. Perhaps a master, drunk from the Symposium, grew jealous at a glance the boy gave another. Or a wife, bitter from the intrusion of his presence, whispered accusations of arrogance. Or another servant, envious of his privileges, suggested he was careless. And these small sparks could ignite into punishment, swift and unpredictable. Some punishments were physical strikes, confinement, the withholding of food or rest. Others were subtler, colder, perhaps being ignored entirely, pushed aside as though invisible, a cruelty sharper in its silence than in its noise. For two, be dismissed in a world where worth was measured by attention was to feel oneself dissolve into nothingness. And yet, even in these dark corners, history gives us glimpses that the concubine endured not only through suffering, but through strategies of survival. Scholars believe boys sometimes sought alliances with other servants, sharing food, exchanging secrets, creating tiny networks of support hidden within the larger cruelty of the household. And perhaps it was in such whispered friendships that the boy found his truest comfort. Laughter muffled in corners, kindness passed hand to hand in fragments no master could control. Strange details surface in plays and orations, references to boys being locked away, mocked in public, or forced to stand as examples of shame. And though these fragments sting, they remind us that the punishments were real, woven into the fabric of daily life. And yet what they do not show is the resilience that must have flickered quietly within. The way the boy carried memories, the way he held on to scraps of identity, the way he turned survival into an act of quiet rebellion. Imagine the humor he might have found even in such moments, noticing that the same master who struck him for insolence would later call him beautiful, that the same wife who scorned him might copy his style of dress, that the same servants who envied him might whisper advice at night. Contradictions so absurd that they could only be borne by finding a private smile in their irony, a smile invisible but steady. Yet beneath the irony was always the deeper truth that punishment was never about justice, but about control. That cruelty was not the exception, but the structure, and that the boy's life was measured by how well he could endure what he could not predict. At night, lying awake after such punishments, his body aching, his mind circling the fear of what tomorrow might bring, he may have looked toward the faint glow of the lamp, the shadows trembling on the wall, and repeated silently the fragments of himself that could not be struck away, his true name, his earliest memories, the inner voice that told him he was more than this role, more than this silence. And perhaps it was this inner voice that carried him through the darkest nights, reminding him that even when affection turned to cruelty, even when devotion was punished as insolence, there was still within him a pulse that belonged only to himself. Let yourself sink into that image now as you rest. The boy curled on his thin bed, the night quiet except for the distant bark of dogs, the city asleep, and in that stillness, he clings to fragments of selfhood that no punishment can erase. And softly, before your thoughts drift deeper, let me guide you onward. In part 11, we will leave the punishments of the private chamber and step into the broader dangers of the city, the risks of war, of capture, are being traded like spoils across borders, and in doing so, you will see how the concubine's tragedy was not confined to walls alone, but stretched into the very conflicts that defined the Greek world beyond the walls of the house. Beyond the punishments and the rituals of private life, there stretched another danger that shaped the concubine's world war, the endless drumbeat of conflict that defined the Greek city-states. For Athens was never free from rivalry, whether with Sparta, Thebes, Persia, or its own restless allies. And in such times, the concubine's body, already not his own, became even more vulnerable. For wars disrupted households, sent masters marching to campaigns, exposed homes to looting, and sometimes turned the concubine himself into spoil, traded. Like bronze or grain, passed from one hand to another as easily as a captured vessel. Imagine the terror of hearing war news echo through the courtyard. The master called to lead a force, the servants whispering of defeat, the wives anxious about siege, the streets alive with rumors of fleets gathering the Piraeus and for the boy. This meant not only uncertainty about who would return, but fear of what new hands might claim him if they did not. Strange fragments survive in history's accounts of wars where women, children, and youths were carried off, where the conquered were sold into slavery, and though their names vanish, we can imagine concubines among them, taken from Athens to Sparta, from islands to mainland, their lives uprooted not once but again and again, their role of ornament turned into spoils of war, their silence carried across borders like contraband. In the Peloponnesian War, as plague swept through Athens, as food grew scarce, as households collapsed under grief, imagine the concubine in the shadows of this turmoil, still summoned to serve wine, still expected to perform beauty when the city itself was bleeding, a grotesque irony where private rituals continued even as public life crumbled. There is gentle humor, bitter but real, in this contradiction. Men who prided themselves on bravery in battle would return home to demand comforts from the very boys, who had no say in whether the city won or lost, and the concubine pouring wine. For men boasting of victory or lamenting defeat may have smiled faintly inside, knowing that while they spoke of honor and glory, he understood survival in ways their armor never taught them. Yet beneath the humor was always the darker reality. War made him even more disposable, for in times of siege, households rationed food, and a concubine not favored might find himself pushed aside, half-fed, or even abandoned, and in times of conquest, he could be taken as prize by another master, stripped of what little stability he had, forced to relearn the choreography of survival in a new house, a new city, a new set of eyes watching. Imagine the scene of a city under siege, walls trembling with catapult strikes, smoke rising, the streets crowded with refugees clutching their children, and in the midst of it, a concubine moving silently, carrying water for his master, trying not to draw attention from strangers who might see him as spoil, his beauty as liability, his silence as vulnerability. And yet, in such chaos, there was also resilience. Perhaps he remembered a secret path through alleys. Perhaps he clung to alliances with other servants. Perhaps he learned to vanish in the noise, finding survival in invisibility. History tells. Use little of these details, but the very absence speaks loudly, for silence itself is a record, proof that these lives were erased precisely because they endured in ways that did not flatter the victor's stories at night. After a day of war rumors, he may have sat in his chamber, the city restless beyond the walls, and wondered whether the gods who watched from the Acropolis ever cared for someone like him, or if their gaze, like men's, fell only on those who shouted loudly of honor while ignoring the quiet suffering beneath. And yet he held on, because to endure was itself a form of defiance, a way of saying that even if he was treated as spoil, even if his name dissolved, his breath continued, his presence remained, his story would not vanish entirely. Let yourself imagine it now as you drift, the concubine walking through a city scarred by war, the echoes of soldiers' boots in the streets, the flicker of torches on stone, the hush of fear in the air, and within it, the steady quiet of his own footsteps, carrying him forward despite it all. And softly, as your thoughts grow heavier, let me lead you to part 12, where we will step deeper into the contradictions of Greek religion, how temples and myths that praise divine beauty also cursed mortal desire, and how the concubine, living in that paradox, became both sacred and profane, a silent figure caught between worship and shame. If war made the concubine vulnerable to the shifting tides of power, then religion laid another paradox upon his life, for in Greece, the same temples that echoed with hymns to beauty and desire also cast shadows of shame upon mortal bodies that embodied them, and the concubine lived always at the intersection of worship and scorn, caught between the divine myths that glorified youths and the civic morality that condemned them. Imagine walking with him past the Acropolis at dawn, the marble of the Parthenon glowing golden in the rising light, the air heavy with incense from morning sacrifices, priests in long robes chanting prayers to Athena, while painted vases in. Nearby workshops showed Ganymede, the boy carried away by Zeus, forever beautiful, forever young, celebrated as divine cupbearer, the very role that echoed the concubine's own service at Symposia. For the boy, hearing the myth repeated at feasts, seeing his likeness compared to the youth stolen by a god, the irony must have stung. What poets praise as sacred abduction, he lived as earthly compulsion, what sculptors carved into marble. As perfection he endured as duty without escape, and though he could not say it aloud, he must have felt the distance between myth and reality press heavily on his chest. Strange fragments of Greek religion reveal this tension. Rituals at sanctuaries where boys were whipped before statues of Artemis, initiations where youths were paraded as symbols of fertility, ceremonies where beauty was honored with garlands, even as the laws of the city mocked those who accepted gifts in return for their company. And so the concubine was trapped in a strange paradox celebrated in myth, condemned in law, praised in art, erased in life. Imagine the gentle humor he might have found in this contradiction. Priests declaring purity while slipping glances at him, poets comparing him to heroes while warning him of disgrace, worshippers offering sacrifices to gods of love while whispering scorn for mortal loves, and in these moments, the boy's inward smile may have been his only shield, a way of surviving the hypocrisy by recognizing it silently. Yet beneath the humor was always the darker truth that religion, which should have offered solace, often reinforced his burden, reminding him that he was not free, that his beauty was sacred only as symbol, never as self, that he was praised only when silent, punished when seen too clearly. Imagine him standing at the edge of a festival, watching dancers whirl, hearing hymns echo off stone, smelling roasted offerings on the altar, while men around him lifted prayers for victory, for fertility, for glory, and wondering if any prayer had ever been spoken for someone like him, if the gods who carry boys into heaven ever cared for the ones trapped in chambers on earth. And yet, perhaps he found resilience in myth as well, for Ganymede, though stolen, became immortal, and maybe the boy whispered to himself at night that his story too would not vanish, that though no priest carved his name into stone, he lived as part of the same current of beauty and suffering that gave Greece its songs and statues. Let yourself sink into this paradox now as you rest. The blending of incense and silence, the marble shining in the dawn, the boy walking quietly beneath the temples that praised what they denied, holding within him the fragile hope that even if men scorned him, the gods had already recognized his existence. And softly, before your eyelids grow heavier, follow me toward part 13, where we will enter the world of art itself, the painted vases and carved statues that preserved his image more faithfully than the city ever did. And in those fragments of clay and marble, we will glimpse how beauty became eternal, even while the boys themselves faded into silence. If the temples and myths offered only a paradoxical reflection of the concubine's life, then the art of Greece preserved him more faithfully than words ever did. For while names vanished and stories dissolved into silence, the painted vases, carved statues, and etched gems left behind fragments of his presence, fragments that scholars still trace with fingertips centuries later, as if clay and marble carried whispers that parchment refused to write. Imagine stepping with him into a potter's workshop in Athens. The air thick with dust, the smell of clay dampened with water, the wheels spinning slowly, hands shaping vessels that would one day carry wine, and on their surfaces, scenes were painted. You serving wine to older men, boys adorned with wreaths, the delicate gestures of hands offering cups, their beauty frozen forever in the red and black figures that even now sit in museums across the world. For the concubine, had he glimpsed such a vase while pouring wine at a feast, the recognition may have struck strangely. Here was his likeness, immortalized not for who he was, but for what he represented. Here was his silence made eternal decoration. His life reduced to an image that others admired without ever asking for his name. And yet there is something hauntingly tender in this fact, that though Athens erased him in law and mocked him in speech, its artists could not help but etch his presence into the objects of daily life. Vessels used for drinking, jars used for storing oil, images that travel from household to household, carrying his silhouette into eternity. Strange details emerged from archaeology rings carved with the faces of boys, coins showing idealized youths, even graffiti scratched in the stone walls. And though these fragments are not personal diaries, they are echoes, proof that the concubines' existence was woven so deeply into Greek culture that it could not be hidden even when words tried to deny it. Imagine the humor he might have found in this irony, that the very men who scolded him or punished him might one day drink from a cup bearing his likeness, lifting his image to their lips without realizing the mockery of it, that even centuries later scholars would stare reverently at clay jars decorated with the roles he once endured silently, that while his voice was erased, his shadow lived on in museums where strangers whispered about beauty without knowing the weight of its costs. And yet beneath this gentle humor is the darker truth that art, while it immortalized his body, could not immortalize his humanity, that the curve of a painted arm, the tilt of a head, the softness of a gaze were all preserved, but the laughter he once stifled, the memories he once carried, the name his mother once called him, all vanished, leaving only form without story. Silence turned into ornament. At night, perhaps he thought of this, lying beneath the flicker of lamplight, hearing the echo of the potter's wheel in his mind, wondering if his life too would be painted somewhere. If centuries later, strangers might look upon his likeness and mistake decoration for destiny. And in that thought there was both sorrow and strength. For even if he could not shape how he was remembered, he could still hold within himself the fragments that no artist could capture, the sound of his own heartbeat, the flicker of his private smile, the quiet hum of a song he whispered to himself in the dark. Let yourself imagine it now as you rest. The gleam of painted pottery in firelight, the silent faces of boys staring back across millennia, their beauty frozen, their humanity erased, and yet in our remembering tonight, their story breathes again, soft and alive. And gently, let me guide you onward, because in part 14, we will step into the realm of philosophy, where men like Plato and Socrates debated the meaning of love and beauty, spinning lofty dialogues that both elevated and obscured the concubines' reality, and we will see how the words of philosophers, though eternal, were always written at the expense of the silences that boys like him were forced to carry. If Greek art preserved the concubine in silhouette and gesture, then philosophy wrapped him in words lofty enough to seem eternal, yet distant enough to erase his reality. For the great names of Athens, Plato, Socrates, Xenophon, even Aristotle spoke often of love between older men and younger boys, cloaking their debates in ideals of virtue, beauty, and the elevation of the soul. And yet the actual boys who lived such roles remained silent, absent, their real lives reduced to examples in dialogues, their pain translated into abstractions, their presence a tool to illustrate arguments rather than a truth to be honored. Imagine the boy at a symposium, standing with jug in hand as Socratic conversation unfolded nearby, men leaning on couches with garlands on their heads, discussing whether love could be noble, whether beauty inspired the mind toward the divine. And all the while the concubine himself moved quietly among them, hearing himself described not as a person, but as an idea, his body turned into philosophy, his silence into metaphor. Plato's Symposium spoke of a love that transcended the flesh, praising the ascent from desire for a boy's beauty to contemplation of eternal forms, and yet the concubine pouring wine at the edge of the gathering must have felt the irony of hearing his own body praised as a doorway to eternity, while never being asked what it meant to be that doorway, to be walked through, admired, but never truly acknowledged. There is a gentle humor in this. If one listens carefully, the philosophers who claimed that physical desire was a distraction could not stop themselves from writing endlessly about it, turning the very bodies they claimed to transcend into the foundation of their loftiest arguments. And the boy, listening quietly, may have smiled inwardly, realizing that for all their wisdom, they were still tangled in the same contradictions as the drunken men who reached for him. Yet beneath this humor is the darker truth that philosophy gave men license to speak of love while denying boys the power to define it for themselves. That the same dialogues that praised noble affection ignored the scars of ownership, the fears of punishment, the fragility of beauty. And so, while the names of Plato and Socrates were etched into history, the names of the boys they described dissolved into silence. Imagine the concubine later that night, lying in his small chamber, recalling fragments of their debates' words about virtue, about the good life, about the immortality of the soul, and wondering whether any of those lofty ideals would ever reach him, whether the men who spoke of transcending desire ever saw the humanity in the body that made them speak at all. Perhaps he hummed softly to himself, repeating his own name in the dark, as if to remind himself that he was not only an example for another's philosophy, but a life with its own memories, its own desires, its own story, however unwritten. The irony deepens when we recall how philosophy shaped later generations. Centuries of thinkers citing Greek ideals of beauty and love, centuries of cultures looking back to Athens as the birthplace of wisdom, while forgetting that behind those ideals were boys whose silence was the foundation for eloquence. Let yourself feel this paradox now as you drift. The murmur of voices debating eternity while a boy refills their cups. The glow of lamplight on marble statues of philosophers while the living shadows who inspired their words fade into dust. And in that quiet contrast, recognize the truth that history's brightest lights are always cast against forgotten faces. And softly, let us move onward. Because in part 15, we will leave the lofty halls of philosophy and step back into the raw intimacy of daily survival, exploring how concubines created secret friendships, fragile bonds, and small rebellions within. The narrow confines of their lives, weaving networks of care in a world that denied them recognition. And how these quiet acts of connection were as vital as any philosophy or art. If philosophy turned the concubine into an abstraction and art froze him in silhouette, then daily survival turned him into something more fragile, yet more human. For, beneath the marble statues and lofty dialogues, the boys themselves wove quiet networks of care, whispered bonds that allowed them to endure what would have otherwise been unbearable. And these friendships, these secret rebellions against silence, may have been the only refuge they had in a world that treated them as ornaments rather than souls. Imagine the courtyard of a wealthy Athenian house at dusk, the lamps being lit, the smell of bread cooling in the kitchens, the servants finishing their chores, and in some shadow corner, two boys leaning close, their voices hushed, sharing fragments of the day, one recounting how a guest at the symposium had mocked him, the other offering the comfort of a stolen fig, their laughter muffled but real, their bond an island of tenderness in a sea of control. History rarely records such bonds, but hints survive, small graffiti etched on stone walls with initials joined together, fragments of poetry that scholars suspect were passed between servants, even the subtle scenes painted on vases showing pairs of boys side by side, not as master and slave, not as ornament and owner, but simply as companions. For the concubine, such friendships were not luxuries but necessities, the only way to remember that he was more than a role, more than a shadow in someone else's story. Strange details appear in the margins of plays, jokes about boys slipping, a way to meet each other, references to youths exchanging trinkets, hints that even within households bound by hierarchy, moments of rebellion thrive in the form of secret connection. Imagine the humor they must have shared teasing one another about the way a master slurred his words, mocking the pompous speeches of philosophers they overheard, inventing silly songs to drown out the sound of wine cups clinking in the Andron Ann. Though such humor was soft and hidden, it was a lifeline, proof that laughter could still exist even in rooms heavy with command. And yet, beneath the laughter was always the darker truth that such bonds were fragile, always at risk of discovery, for punishment could follow if masters suspected disobedience, if wives sensed distraction, if rivals whispered jealous lies. And so the boys learned to make their rebellion subtle, a glance exchanged in the corridor, a fig passed in the palm, a line of a poem scratched into wood where only one other would see. These were not grand revolts but quiet acts of preservation, proof that even in silence the human spirit found ways to resist. At night, lying awake after such stolen moments, the concubine may have replayed the laughter in his mind, holding it close like a lamp against the dark. And though he knew that tomorrow would bring the same summons, the same weight, the same silence, he carried the memory of friendship as armor, thin but unbreakable. Imagine yourself now drifting with him into that quiet. Two boys in the corner of a courtyard, their whispers blending with the rustle of fig leaves, their laughter soft as wind through olive trees, their rebellion invisible to history, but eternal in the human heart. And softly, let me guide you forward, because in part 16 we will lead these secret friendships and step into the aging of the concubine, the slow fading of beauty that once defined his worth, and explore how, as youth slipped away, his tragedy deepened and yet his perspective sharpened, revealing what it meant to live in a world where time itself was the cruelest master. If secret friendships offered the concubine fragile relief, then the slow passing of time confronted him with a truth he could never escape. For in Athens, youth was both a blessing and a curse, a currency that purchased status for others but expired quickly. And so as the boy's beauty began to soften with age, as the roundness of his cheeks gave way to sharper lines, as the brightness of his eyes dulled with weariness, he felt the slow unraveling of the very quality upon which his survival had depended. Imagine him noticing it first in glances men who once lingered on his presence, looking past him. Masters who once praised his appearance beginning to joke about new favorites. Wives whose bitterness cooled into indifference. Servants who know. Longer envied him but pitied him. And within these shifts, he recognized that the clock of his worth had always been ticking. That every night in a chamber, every day at a symposium, was part of a countdown leading toward this moment of fading. Strange fragments from orations confirmed the cruelty of this decline. Men mocked rivals by accusing them of having been concubines in youth, as if the mere fact of once being desired condemned them forever. And yet when those same youths aged, they were cast aside, no longer even considered valuable enough to be mocked, dissolved into invisibility. For the concubine himself, this transition was not sudden but gradual, like the dimming of a lamp one day praised, the next tolerated, the next ignored, and in that slow descent he faced not only the loss of status, but the loss of identity. For who was he, if not the beautiful youth poured into poetry and painted on vases, if not the ornament that justified his master's pride? Imagine the gentle humor he might have found in this cruel transformation, that philosophers could speak of beauty as eternal, while their glances betrayed them the moment wrinkles appeared, that men who prided themselves on virtue still measured worth in smooth skin and bright eyes, that a society obsessed with immortality in art treated living beauty as disposable. And though such irony was bitter, perhaps he smiled faintly at the absurdity, because humor, even small, was a way to remain human in the face of erasure. Yet beneath the humor was the darker truth that many aged concubines faced cruel fates, sold into harsher labor once their youth was gone, sent to work in workshops or fields, pushed into obscurity as nameless servants, or in rare cases allowed to remain in a household as a scribe, a teacher, a companion, but always carrying the shadow of what they had once been, never able to erase the silence of their youth. Imagine the boy, now older, standing in the courtyard at dusk, watching new youths arrive, their faces bright, their steps uncertain, and feeling in them both recognition and sorrow, remembering his own beginning and knowing their ending before it began, wanting perhaps to whisper advice, but bound by the same silence that had shaped his life at night, lying on his straw mattress, his body aching from years of service, his mind filled with memories of laughter, punishment, tenderness, fear. He may have wondered what of him would endure, if anything, or if he would dissolve entirely into the dust of Athens, another nameless shadow erased by time. And yet, even in this fading, there was resilience, the ability to carry his own story, inward, to treasure his friendships, his fragments, his humor, his name, even if no one else spoke it. Let yourself imagine this now as you rest. The concubine, older, quieter, sitting by a lamp, watching the flame tremble, recognizing that his beauty had been his prison, but also his survival, and feeling within himself the fragile dignity of endurance. And softly, let us move onward, because in part 17 we will step into how some concubines, even as their beauty faded, found ways to reshape their lives as scribes, musicians, confidants, or teachers, and how within these unexpected transformations, we glimpsed the quiet strength of survival that history almost forgot of aging dimmed the concubine's beauty and pushed him toward invisibility. It also opened, for a few, the fragile chance to reshape their lives into roles that offered a different kind of survival. And though these transformations were rare and seldom recorded, they remind us that endurance sometimes took the form of reinvention. Scribes, musicians, confidants, even teachers of younger servants, men who once lived in silence, now navigating the margins of usefulness in ways that allowed them to remain within the household, without entirely dissolving into obscurity. Imagine the boy now grown, his face less striking, his body less adorned, his presence no longer drawing the same lingering gazes at symposiums. And yet, instead of being sold off into harsher labor, he was given a set of wax tablets and a stylus, taught to copy down accounts, to record expenses, to draft letters, and in the slow rhythm of writing, he found a different kind of power. Words, once weapons wielded against him in orations, now flowing from his own hand, his silence translated into marks that others depended upon. Strange fragments hint at such roles, inscriptions noting former slaves serving as secretaries, graffiti written in careful, practiced hands, testimonies of scribes who began as household attendants, and it is not impossible that among them were concubines whose fading beauty forced masters to discover other uses. Imagine the irony he may have savored, that once his value had been in his face, now it was in his ability to preserve the words of men who once treated him as an ornament. That once he had been silenced, now he carried their voices into permanence. A quiet reversal that, though small, gave him a measure of dignity. Others found survival in music, no longer adored for the curve of their shoulders, but for the way their fingers coaxed melody from a lyre. Their songs fill in the courtyards at evening, their voices leading choruses at festivals, and though the applause was never quite freedom, it was recognition of a kind, proof that they could still shape the air around them, still be remembered not only as a shadow of beauty, but as a vessel of sound. Some became confidants to their masters, not as lovers but as listeners, repositories of secrets too dangerous to be spoken elsewhere. Their silence transformed into counsel, their endurance into trust, and though this role was fragile, trust could vanish as quickly as affection. It offered another form of survival, one where their humanity flickered more visibly. Imagine the gentle humor of such transformations, that the same men who once demanded their beauty now depended on their discretion, that the same city that mocked concubines for weakness now leaned on them for wisdom, that the same poets who wrote verses of youthful desire now sought out their age voices for stories of the past. And yet, beneath the humor, the darker truth remained. For every concubine who found such reinvention, countless others were discarded, sent to labor, erased into anonymity, their lives forgotten by the very households that once flaunted them. Still, Those who endured carried within themselves a knowledge deeper than philosophy and sharper than law, that beauty may fade, but survival could create new forms of value, that silence may be imposed, but memory could still be held inward, and that even in erasure, fragments of self could remain untouchable. Imagine him now, older, seated in a quiet corner with stylus in hand, or with lyre resting against his knees, or simply listening to his master confess fears of politics and aging, and see how, in this stillness, he claimed a subtle dignity. Not the dignity of statues or speeches, but the dignity of survival itself. Let yourself drift with that image as you rest. The concubine no longer dazzling with youth, but steady with endurance, reshaped by necessity, still carrying a story that refused to vanish. And softly, let us move onward, because in part 18 we will follow this thread further, into the rare but telling moments when aged concubines became teachers, guiding younger servants or concubines, passing along the secret wisdom of survival. And in those quiet lessons, we will see how knowledge, hidden and unrecorded, became the only inheritance they could offer in a world that denied them names. And now, as the long arc of this story folds in the quiet, the figure of the concubine drifts from the vivid chambers of Athens into the softer silence of memory. For his life, like a lamp flame trembling in a draught, was never meant to blaze eternally, but to flicker just long enough to illuminate truths that the city itself refused to name. And yet, even in that flicker, something enduring remains. Imagine him older now, his beauty faded, his presence less demanded, yet still walking the streets of Athens with the same careful posture he learned in youth, still carrying the lessons of silence and survival etched into his body like invisible tattoos, and though passers-by no longer turn their heads, he carries within him the voices of younger boys he once taught, the laughter of stolen friendships, the irony of overheard debates, the fragments of himself that were never erased. He knows now that he will not be remembered in statues or poems, that history will keep speaking of philosophers and generals while leaving his name buried in dust. But he also knows that his shadow is already scattered through the city, in the painted curve of a boy on a vase, in the lines of an orator's insult, in the myths whispered at festivals, in the secrets carried by others who endured as he did. His tragedy was that he was treated as an ornament, a symbol, a currency. Yet his quiet victory was that he lived, he endured, he passed on what he could. And in endurance there is a dignity deeper than beauty, a truth stronger than silence. Tonight, as you rest, let the city fade around him, the lamps guttering low, the footsteps on marble softening, the laughter of symposiums dissolving into echoes, until there is only the stillness of one man lying on his straw bed, his eyes closed, his breath steady, carrying within him a world of memory that no master could own. Perhaps the gods he once doubted do see him after all, not as ornament or shame, but as witness, as story, as life itself. And in that recognition there is peace. And so, softly, we close the curtain on him now, not with thunderous applause, not with the carved permanence of marble, but with the gentleness of remembering, with the quiet acknowledgement that he was here, that his silence was never empty, that his story belongs not only to Athens, but to us, listening in the dark. And maybe your own eyes are heavier now, your body sinking into rest, the night wrapping around you like a cloak. And if so, then let his story drift with you into dreams, carrying its paradox of beauty and sorrow, survival and silence, and let it remind you that even the forgotten leave traces, even the erased leave echoes, even the quietest lives shape history in ways that still reach us, centuries later, in whispers softer than sleep.